Let's dive in if that's all right with folks. We're going to talk today about what to expect of the next 6 months, right? We're almost exactly halfway through 2021. It's already been a pretty wild year, as you can imagine. How are things changing in the world? What should we do about them? And then what are some really tactical next steps that we can put into action now as we think about being successful in August, September, October, November, et cetera. One quick note here, and many of you will know this, but this event is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits. So if you don't have CFRE credit, if you don't care about this, don't worry about it. But many of you who are working towards professional certification or recertification, this is really important. We also know that a lot of your budgets have gotten zeroed out from a professional development standpoint. And so that's been a big challenge. So this is all free. It's one credit. It is possible, by the way, that you get audited, right? Meaning that CFRE says, prove that you did all this stuff. And so what you need to do is at the end of this session, make sure to fill out the survey. It's very, very quick, but it just allows us to keep a record. We don't sort of send you any official records unless you get audited, and then we can back you up if you need it. So that's there. We've also done a lot of these sessions. They're all worth 1 credit. So if you need to catch up, you can go back and watch some of the other stuff on effective writing and donor advised funds and some other things as well. All right, so let's dive in. Introductions. My name is Patrick. I've met a lot of you. I have some great friends on the call. Really just delighted to see so many of you again. I am the co-founder of a company called FreeWill alongside my wonderful, wonderful co-founder, Jenny. Usually we are co-CEOs. This month, I'm solo CEOing because Jenny just had her first child. So she is taking care of, she and her husband, Pete, are taking care of baby Mark up on Bainbridge Island off the coast of Seattle. I know some folks here might be from Bainbridge as well. So we wish Jenny all the best there. And then really lucky to be part of the FreeWill team, closing in on 100 people, which feels a little bit wild from our point of view. And we've raised about $3.1 billion in terms of new gifts and commitments for charities, and we're really excited about that. All right, one thing we like to do sometimes is give away books that we think can be really helpful to your careers or your life. One of these books that is sort of one of the canonical things around really understanding how humans make decisions and what you can do to influence human decision making, which will be really important, especially if you're a major gift officer or a fundraising leader. And so this book, Influence by Dr. Robert Cialdini, is excellent. It's one of the things I've read along the way, and it's been one of the most insightful books that I've come across. And it's really helpful in sort of normal daily life. It's a book called Influence. We'll send a copy of this to 20 people. So if you're interested, just make a note in the survey. Make sure to actually include your address so we can send it to you. And then we'll randomly select later this week and send it out. So hopefully you'll get that as well. Other things on intros, we asked how your week is going. And you can see this sort of curve over time, right? And so you look at basically mid-January is this dividing line where happiness goes way up, anxiety goes way down. You can see anxiety trending down a little bit more this week, which is really good. And so just sort of delightful to watch this unfold over time. You go back to this time last year. I mean, think about where we were just 1 year ago. You can look over here in sort of center left here, and the amount of anxiety that people were feeling, the amount of loneliness that people were feeling is much higher. And suddenly we're really that's been flipped. So really great to see overall. The other thing we're going to start tracking here is sort of a general confidence measure across the nonprofit industry. So we've asked people how confident you are about hitting your goals this year. And you can see the average is about 3.9. So we'll begin to track this week over week. 25% of you, only a quarter, are very confident. 25% are really in the middle. And then a couple people are very not confident about hitting their goals. And so we'll keep an eye on this. And hopefully some of the insights that we share today will actually move you up that confidence scale and make you feel a bit more comfortable with what you're doing. And then the last question we asked is, are you working from home? And one thing that's really striking is that half of folks are still working remotely. 43% are not. And then some folks are planning to stay remote, which is a really big shift, right? It's going to really change the nature of our work, both for you, and also this isn't going to be so dissimilar from a lot of your donors. And so their experience is shifting. And then actually we asked, what are you most looking forward to this fall? Just to get a sense of you as humans, not just fundraising professionals, and you'll, excuse me, you'll start to see how this mirrors some of the work of other folks in the country. So what does that look like? Excuse me. One big thing people are looking forward to is hosting cultivation events and exhibit openings, traveling, and kids going back to school, both for the kids and for your sanity. performing live with audiences, traveling to see my son on the other coast, college football, especially with crowds, annual trip to Maine, first golf fundraising event and a new planned giving website, hiking, and a bunch of other stuff as well. So really excited to see what sort of people have as hopes and dreams for the fall. Going back to church, hopefully the end of the pandemic, spending a few days in the office, getting to meet coworkers for the first time. We have something like 30 new coworkers who I've never met in person, and I'm really delighted about that. A more normal looking school campus, etc. Okay, so let's dive in here and talk about what's happening in the world and what is that likely to mean for fundraising. First thing, some really, really good news. And this came out of the Fundraising Effectiveness Project by AFP very, very recently. So one of the things that's shifting is the retention rate among new donors, right? And what does that mean? It means donors who gave for the first time in the previous 12 months, who gave again in subsequent months. And so we saw 35% of these donors were retained. This was a big jump, right? So really big shift, 35% higher retention among new donors. So this is really exciting, right? This is one of the biggest challenges in fundraising is not getting new donors. It's retaining first-time donors and making them second, third, 10th time donors. And so this is beginning to shift and pretty exciting. Why is this happening? Well, we're seeing a lot of organizations that experience a surge of donors in 2020, and typically new donors, especially new donors who are coming at a sort of high noteworthy moment, are the hardest to retain. So for instance, if you're doing hurricane relief, you might get a flood of donations. And then if there's not a massive hurricane in the news the next year, a lot of that will dry up. And yet what we're seeing is a really big shift here. So in Q1, new donor rates were up by 13.6%, which is very considerable. And what it means is that actually, that's Q1, which is historically not a strong giving year, not a strong giving quarter. And so we have a really big opportunity to retain and grow these donors in the coming months as we go into the new year, right? So one of the things that we're going to start thinking about is as we look at end of year giving, not just sort of looking at our monolith of bases, but what do we do with the folks who gave for the first time last year? And how do we make sure they're engaged? Now, why is that important? Well, obviously, more gifts this year is great. Getting that second gift is going to be really imperative to getting the third, fifth, 10th gift. Okay, so that's sort of one dynamic that we're seeing. It's really interesting, and it's a really positive sign for the industry overall. What is a positive and negative sign? Well, foundation giving was dramatically up in 2020, right? $89 billion higher, or $289 billion, so a considerable jump. This is they made 19% of all giving, right? Foundation giving was almost 20% of all giving, the highest dollar amount and the largest percentage ever. What it means is that's good news in 2020. Foundations don't have endless money. It is likely that foundation giving will go down this year, right? Because so much of that money was shipped out last year that foundations are now regrowing their endowments to a large degree. And so that's going to constrain, and it's going to make us more reliant on other types of giving, right? So just taking a step back for a moment, what are the major types of giving in the country? Individual giving, typically, let's call it 70%. Foundations, typically 15%, now 19%. Corporate giving, typically 5%, rough, give or take. And then bequests, planned giving, many of you will know sort of deeply what that is, we'll go more into in a second, about 10%, right? So those are the big categories. Foundation giving really pushed up. And what it's likely to do is actually push considerably down this year, making us more dependent on the other three major types of giving. Now, corporate giving, it went down in 2020, right? So corporate giving decreased by 6% in 2020 to less than 17 billion, right? So typically about 5% of all giving, a little bit less in 2020. Now, why did this happen? Well, job losses, uncertainty, and that's actually a really big thing here, right? So it's in response to fewer pre-tax profits, lower overall GDP, not surprising in the least. Now, what is one of the biggest impacts on corporate giving? It's not simply profits, right? That's obviously a really big part of it, but instead it's certainty. And so even though the economy is bouncing back in 2021, we're probably not going to see a large increase in corporate giving, because even though there's a lot more profit and a lot more sort of general revenue for a lot of these businesses, we're still navigating, the corporate world is still navigating a deeply uncertain world, and they really want to protect resources in order to strategically allocate them, right? When you have a strong but steady economy, that's a much easier, more conducive way to get a lot of corporate giving. Here, there's a lot of uncertainty, right? You're reading about labor shortages, you're reading about increased competition, risks of inflation. All these things are on the mind of a typical large company CEO. And so you're going to see a little bit less corporate giving than in previous years, even if it does go up slightly over 2020. So what else is happening? Well, Luann just made this note. A huge increase in donor advised funds. I mean, just unbelievably large over time. So grant making from donor advised funds, these are gifts out of donor advised funds, increased 93% from 2015 to 2019. We don't have great 2020 numbers yet. Money going into donor advised funds also increased year over year. That's that YOY is year over year. And between 19 and early 20, grant making increased 66% as donors recommended grants for COVID relief. So you see this enormous shift. I mean, look at this. So these are contributions to donor advised funds as a percentage of total individual giving, right? So by 2019, 13% of all contributions, all charitable giving anywhere went into donor advised funds. By 2021, by the end of this year, we're expecting 14 to 17%. Just enormous sums going this, right? I mean, you think about 17% is equal to, potentially the entire education sector, or roughly around that as an idea. So just enormous. What else is happening here? So money coming out of donor advised funds is also increasing, right? So all this money goes in, it doesn't stay there forever. And so in 2019, you saw $27 billion come out of donor advised funds into charitable giving. Let's assume that number is probably in the mid 30 billion in 2020. We don't have perfect numbers yet. And we should see in 2021 somewhere between 31 and $40 billion coming out of donor advised funds, right? We're looking at almost 10% of all giving is coming out of donor advised funds. So this is a massive shift that's been happening, and you can see how steadily increased this is. Money going into donor advised funds keeps going up, right? So in 2019, $38 billion went into donor advised funds. This is probably going to look at 50 to 55 billion by 2021. I mean, just unfathomably large amounts. And so this is one of the most pressing issues for the nonprofit community, thinking about how do we get more money out of donor advised funds. There's a lot of work right now in Congress to sort of speed up some of these this gifting. It's sort of unclear whether that's likely to have a meaningful effect, right? So it's not this money staying in for 20 years, but it is staying and growing. Now, why we'll dive into this in a moment, but we want to talk more about why this is happening as opposed to just noting that it is happening, because this is a really important topic. So insight number 5, one of the things that's really interesting is we can really, at FreeWill and also looking at a bunch of other research, really understand when people are doing their estate plans, which is when people are making planned gifts, right? This is one of the most important moments to be in front of donors, and it's actually in the fall or the spring. So Google searches for things like make a will increase dramatically in the spring and the fall. Now you might think, oh, what about summer? What about the holidays? People with their families? It's good insight, it's good instinct, not actually true. So what we see is that many people actually make their wills at work, or when they're in the habit of sort of getting things done, not while they're at home on the holidays in the winter or summer with family. And so what it indicates is that fall is actually one of the best times to approach donors about estate planning and legacy gifts, and we're going to talk about some really specific tactics to do this as well. 67% of organizations, by the way, secure most of their planned gifts in the fall and the winter, right? So the fall is really dominant here. And you can think the winter is true, but it's not really sort of around Christmas, New Year's, right? People don't really do their estate planning then. Instead, it's sort of in the broad months generally. Here's what it actually looks like on Google. So one of the helpful tools we can use in research is something called Google Trends, which will measure search volume over time. And you can see these orange arrows are fall and spring, right? And so you can see these sort of big rises in searches and interests for people doing their estate plans in these times. So really interesting to look at sort of the broad data of all Americans. All right, what else is interesting? So one of the things we're seeing is that in December, these are things you have to get ready for now though. is Google searches for things like the best charities increase rapidly in the first few weeks of December. And it's not just best charities, right? It's best charities for animals, best charities for the environment, best charities for education. And so why does this happen? Well, they want to give, but we tend to sort of sometimes overestimate the affinity that people have for a specific charity, as opposed to the affinity they have for the cause itself, right? And the charity, giving to charity is just a strategy for having impact on that cause. And so they're ready to give, and they're just looking for some sort of guidance as to whom to give. And so when we look at Google Trends again, looking at best charities, look at these massive spikes in December, right? These orange arrows. The only time that that's sort of equaled is an early peak of COVID, where people are trying to figure out what are the best charities to donate to help with COVID, right, or COVID relief. And so otherwise, you see how much larger they are in December than any other part of the year. So how do we actually tap into this? You know, besides just doing great work, which many of you are doing. One of the things, some of you will be familiar with this, but some of you won't, something called SEO, right? Commonly called SEO. The actual acronym is search engine optimization. What does that mean? It means how do I actually get my pages, my websites found on Google? And so when you look at your own website, right, think not just is it pretty, but are we using keywords that people are going to search for across our website? And do we want to write articles or blog posts or something else on our website that are going to answer donors' queries in the sector? So for example, you might write a list of best environmental organizations to support or best charities to help the environment, right? And include others in that list. Or you might want to write something that says, you know, why the World Wildlife Fund is one of the best charities to support animals. And you have that there. And so when someone searches best charities to support animals, the Why the World Wildlife Fund is up there as one of the pages that are very high in the ranking. And suddenly we're getting a lot of these donors who are actively interested in finding ways to give that impact the causes they care about, which is the cause that you work on, right? So this is a really sort of relatively cheap and easy way to be generating more donors on top of things like expensive budgeting in terms of, you know, direct mail advertising, other things like that. So the other thing you could do is you can actually pay for some Google ads and search. These are also, we're not going to go into this much, but Google Grants does have some funding that will allow you to sort of spend money on Google ads, and they'll give you, I think, up to $10,000. That may be, if anyone knows what the new cap is, if it's been updated, feel free to add on the chat. But you can bid on keywords like best charities for environment, best charities for whatever. This is going to be less applicable, by the way, if you're a college or if you're a church. People are going to give to their church, right? No one who went to Penn State is Googling best colleges in Pennsylvania and then donating somewhere else. They're donating to their alma mater. And then the other thing is that when you find, you know, if there are existing articles that say things like, you know, the best charities for the environment, and you're not on the list, just go out and reach out to those people and start to engage with them and say, hey, let's actually share some information about why we should be on your list. And maybe you'll make it next year, maybe they'll make an addendum this year. As long as that's in good faith, it's a really good opportunity to get there and sort of get noticed a little bit more. Great. So let's talk about Insight 7. The CARES Act is allowing donors to, even those who are not itemizing, to get a $300 deduction for cash donations in 2020 and 2021. Fall's a really good time to remind donors to use this deduction, but also let them know it's not going to happen again in 2022. So this is really interesting. You know, the deduction is helpful, and we're sort of glad it's here, but it sort of creates weird behavior because people aren't going to use it next year. And so do you risk sort of disincentivizing donors from giving in 2022 because the deduction is gone? And so instead, this is a really good time to start introducing more tax-savvy ways to give, giving stock, giving out of IRAs, giving real estate, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things are going to be much larger. And you know, one of the really important things to remember, especially if you've been in the field for more than 5, 10, 15 years, is that we talk about tax-deductible donations all the time, but for 90% of Americans who are no longer itemizing deductions on their taxes, there's actually no real tax benefit to giving to a 501c3, right? Giving cash. And so that's why you're seeing this massive shift towards things like stock giving, a massive shift into donor advised funds as people are hunting for better and more tax-savvy ways to give. right? So we've got to unlearn a lot of the language that we were using in 2014 because the new tax regime means that a lot of it actually isn't necessarily true. And the kindest thing that we can do for a lot of our donors is help them give in more tax savvy ways, particularly stock giving and DAF giving. All right, so looking at that broad landscape, what do we actually do about it? I want to talk through 4 things that will be really helpful and should help you sort of nudge up the probability that you'll be able to hit your goals this quarter. So first one is there are a couple of crucial planned giving campaigns in the fall, right? And what's really important is that we get our heads around these things. And I'm going to tell a story in a second, but we'll walk through what these is first, right? What they are first. So National Make a Will Month is August, right? August is just we have decided as a collective community that it's National Make a Will Month. And then there's something called NEPA, or National Estate Planning Awareness Week, which is October 18th to 24th. Now, I remember a few years ago, people on our team said, oh my gosh, well, I've learned that August is National Make a Will Month and that October is what we call NEPA. We should make a big deal out of this. And I sort of pushed back. I said, listen, nobody cares about this, right? No one, I could go stop 150 people on the street and nobody would know that August is National Make a Will Month. These things are totally arbitrary. This is a waste of time. It's stupid. Let's not do this. And thankfully, they ignored me. And what we realized is that last year, our nonprofit partners received almost $100 million in bequests in August. Now, and so I was just wrong, right? That actually this is an incredibly powerful moment. And against my instincts, this turns out to be really, really useful. So why is that? And by the way, many of you don't do this yet. In our surveys, only 3% participated in. Those that are participating are wildly more successful than those who aren't. So let's look at why this is the case, right? Like you probably think it doesn't matter. I thought it didn't matter. And yet we were both wrong, right? So why is that? Well, first of all, 70% of Americans don't have an up-to-date will or trust or estate plan, right? So huge crisis in the country. And actually 52% of you guys, right? People who are fundraising professionals, thoughtful adults, mostly educated, don't have one as well, right? So huge problem overall, not just among this sort of general public, but actually with you all. And so why don't people have it? Usually they just say, I haven't gotten around to it yet. And so to take action, people need a good reason to make an estate plan, and they need some sense of urgency. And the lack of urgency is one of the biggest things that holds back planned giving overall. People will always say, I'll do it next year, even though I said that last year. And so the other thing that's lacking is that you never know that other people are doing it. So this idea of having social proof that other people are doing this right now is really important. So what does that look like, right? So these campaigns saying, hey, it's National Make a Will Month. It's National Estate Planning Awareness Week. You provide donors with some pathway, right? You can use FreeWill. You can also use other tools. You capture a lot more legacy supporters as people are making their plans. And you give people a chance to inform you of bequests that they've already committed in their wills. But these really work because interest in will making spikes here. And we're finally have a reason to say, okay, do it now. Do it this week, do it this month. And other people are doing it. So let's sort of talk about what this looks like in an email or how to frame it, because I'm continually surprised at how effective this is, but it's remarkably effective, right? So most of our, most emails that people sent were generating significant numbers of new gifts. And what do those look like? Here's an example. So this is just some content that you can use. August is National Make a Will Month, so I wanted to reach out to a free resource that thousands have already used to take care of their families, et cetera, et cetera. It's totally free, use it in 20 minutes. Couple things to point out. This third paragraph, everyone needs a will, whether they're 18 or 80, is really important. Why is it important? 2 reasons. One, it pushes the idea to young people or people who are 30 or 40 or 50 or 60 that they also need an estate plan. And second, it shows the folks who are getting this who are 85 that they're not getting it because they're 85, right? So this is a really important mechanism to sort of demonstrate that it's a wide berth and you're not sort of picking on anyone because they're older. And then as sort of an addendum at the end here, it says, while you're writing a will, you have a chance to include a gift to our organization. You don't have to, but it's there, right? So what we're really trying to do is move people to action to actually do their estate planning. And And that is actually the big barrier in getting new gifts. It's not convincing people that your organization is great. If it wasn't great, they wouldn't have given to you 5 years in a row already. So this is a big shift. You can see this, something called the Happily Ever After Animal Sanctuary, which is wonderful. They do it. If you're a pet organization, you'll be even more effective, right? Because people talk about not just taking care of your kids and your stuff, but actually assigning a guardian for your pet is a really compelling message for why people should be doing this. And so what we're seeing is these animal organizations and these people that can sort of give a reason for why you should be making an estate plan have even more impact, right? So this is a really interesting dynamic, and treating this as a service really ups the number of plans that are made and subsequent bequests that are made, which is really exciting. So a couple of tips here. This is National Estate Planning Awareness Week in October. It's usually the last chance to make a big plan giving push before the holidays, right? And it's not something that people don't want to talk about during the holidays. It's that your communications team will yell at you to try to make plan giving appeals during December because they want all these real-time gifts. And so you want to have time-sensitive framing. You want to put urgency around it, right? This urgency that's so often missing from plan giving. And you want to provide supporters with a chance to take action with a little nudge for legacy giving, but it's actually not the main thrust. So emails and then follow-ups, right? So here's a really interesting fact on follow-ups. Follow-up emails off of Make a Will Month and National Estate Planning Awareness Week are actually result in higher conversions than the initial emails. Now that's sort of counterintuitive, right? You would have thought, oh, the people that want to do it are going to do it the first time. And yet we're seeing this dynamic where people need a little bit of time to think about it. And then the second time they're prompted, they're really taking action. So pretty interesting stuff there. So, okay, so that's tip one. Tip two is leaning into QCDs early. So many of you know what QCDs are, but just to reiterate quickly, as you can sort of see, the sun has hit a new part of the window here. QCDs are qualified charitable distributions. They're tax-free gifts from a traditional IRA. They lower a donor's taxable income instead of increasing deductions. We talked earlier about how 90% of Americans don't take deductions anymore. And so if you're over 72, or over 70, QCDs are one of the best possible options here. They meet required minimum distributions, which is the amount of money the government says you have to take out of your IRA after you turn 72. And they end up being much larger gifts from exactly the same people. So 81% of you said you secure the majority of these gifts in the fall and the winter. Pretty exciting. But RMDs, this money that the government says you have to take out, were suspended in 2020. And yet this giving still went up by 20%. Now that RMDs are back, there's a massive opportunity here, right? So 2 years of people are newly eligible. 6 million people are going to be moving into being able to give QCDs. And these gifts are much larger gifts from exactly the same people. So what do we do about this? Well, we want to include QCDs in the fall and end of year fundraising, especially if you have a high percentage of 70+ donors, which is going to be true of most of you. Organizations that marketed QCDs, even twice in 2020, were significantly more likely to be getting a lot of these gifts. And then the way that in the research that we've seen is that mentioning tax savings increases interest in these types of gifts, right? So people, even though it's not the primary reason they're giving, their ears still perk up and they'll give larger gifts this way. And then you want to add urgency. These gifts obviously have to be transferred by December 31st to meet required minimum distributions. So what do we do about this? There's one really important thing that I think a lot of people are missing, and it's a very, very important sort of note to have around QCDs. So you really want to be reaching donors before they take their required minimum distribution and before they donate it elsewhere. So why is this? Well, every year, remember, people have to take an amount of money out of their IRA. And if they don't, they have these huge fines. 50% of the RMD is the fine if you don't do it. So what does that mean? Do you think people are waiting until December 29th to take them? No way, that's too big a risk. So if you're only including QCDs in your very, very end of year giving, it's not a terrible idea to do it, but it's a terrible idea to leave it out earlier, right? Because you need to sort of jump the queue and make sure that they hear about QCDs from you before they take that money out. Because once they take it out as cash, they can't make a QCD anymore. And you actually want to beat other organizations to the punch in some way. Let me just close the shades here as it's getting pretty aggressively light. So waiting till the end of year is not really an option, right? Instead, what we have to do is take action sooner, stronger, and make it really effective, starting in, say, July, August, September, so that we're getting these gifts before that money sort of, the train leaves the station, if that makes sense. So how do we talk about IRAs and QCDs? You want to use as little jargon as possible, and you want to be as clear as possible, right? Read it as though you're a 7th grader and see if it makes sense. The money in your IRA went in pre-tax, so it's going to be taxed almost any way it comes out, whether you take a distribution, even if you pass away in 30 or 50 years. And that's what makes this such a good way to give. Donating directly from your IRA avoids any taxes and allows you to preserve the post-tax money that you already have. And so this ends up being really compelling messaging for QCDs. And so you're just including basic things like this. One of the things we're seeing is that folks, instead of sort of, sometimes they'll have standalone emails about QCDs, and that's really good. But in all of your fundraising, if you have a meaningful portion of folks over 70, this should be a postscript or a little note in every email that goes out, in every piece of mail. Because why would you want to get a $100 cash gift when you could be getting a $2,000 QCD from exactly the same person? All right, third, as DAFs continue to explode, you need to make it easier not to have donor advised funds, right? What do we mean by this? DAF accounts and money going in and out of them are growing very quickly. Why? The tax benefits are considerable, and the national donor advised funds, right? The Fidelities, the Schwabs, the Vanguards, they make it really easy and intuitive to give stock and other non-cash gifts. 64%, almost 2/3 of all money going into donor advised funds are non-cash assets, as opposed to people just writing checks to donor advised funds. And there's obviously some disputes here on whether DAFs are good or bad for nonprofits. But how do we actually do this, right? There are two main ways to deal with donor advised funds. One is you want to make it really easy to give from a DAF. You want it on your website, and not just on your sort of buried on your ways to give page that frankly nobody looks at. You want it front and center on your donate page so that when someone's checking out, they can give out of a DAF. And then separately, you want to make it much easier to give stocks, right? So if your executive director says, we need to get a handle on these donor advised funds, we need a plan. One of the things you should be doing is make it easier for those non-cash assets to go to you directly, and reminding donors that they can easily give these gifts instead of it getting routed through Fidelity and then maybe coming to you 2 years later, right? So that's a really important strategy that some people are missing, right? Because people say, okay, well, donor advised funds are growing, we should do something about it, but they never ask why are donor advised funds growing? And it's because so many people are looking to transfer non-cash assets, saving on capital gains, and you don't make it easy enough to do that to you, right? So Fidelity says, big welcome sign. We'd love for you to transfer stock into your donor advised funds. We'll make it super easy, but your big organization doesn't do the same thing. And then we wonder why there's so much money going to Fidelity and not, major humanitarian organization. And that's actually the reason, right? That it's much easier to give stocks to Fidelity right now than a lot of organizations make it to give to you. And so same thing on your donate page, right? And I get sort of redundant about this, but not just in sort of buried in a ways to give page. On your donate page, you should have a give stock next to a PayPal button or a Visa or MasterCard logo, right? That should be in the flow. Every time someone gives, you should remind them that you can give them, they can give you non-cash assets. And then the fourth thing is that you really want to get some of your giving systems in place now, because you don't want to be scrambling on Thanksgiving to get these in place. So the biggest things that you want to do is make sure that you have easy ways to get major gifts out of things like donor advised funds, stocks, QCDs, crypto, et cetera. Donors can spend tons of time hunting down the right forms. Sometimes they have to wait a long time for you. And so you want all these systems in place so that all of your normal end of year fundraising flows through them in the right way, as opposed to having to make major efforts each time. What does that look like? The Southern Poverty Law Center does this super well, right? Here's an example. This is the normal checkout page, right? So something big happens in the world, SPLC sends a fundraising email about it. And on that checkout page, before it says give cash, giving cash is actually the worst thing that you can do among the many options here. Donating stock or securities, making a donation through your IRA, updating a monthly pledge, et cetera. These things that are all super important and critical to SPLC's mission are going to be much better for both the donor and the organization than giving a $50 check. So make sure to get this in order. If your communications team doesn't want to do it, go show them the research about how non-cash giving is the single biggest driver of fundraising success for organizations, and go from there. All right, so those are some of the big tactics and trends. A couple of quick things to summarize. One, if you fill out the survey, we're going to send this to 20 people. One of the best books you can read in terms of changing your life. So make sure to do that. We've also just put together a big report on charitable gifts of appreciated stock, done tons of original research, really sort of drawn some interesting conclusions there. If you want that, we'll send it out. And we have an article on making a will month, how to actually make the best of this, and based on sort of experimentation with hundreds of organizations. Really excited about that as well. That's pretty short and easily to read. So just make a note in the survey if you want to receive these. Couple other quick notes. On Thursday, July 15th, so not for a couple weeks, we're going to do a quick 30-minute demo of how a lot of different organizations are using some of these planned and major giving tools. I won't be there. My colleagues Alyssa and Josephine are wonderful. They will be there and they'll walk you through it. If you want an invite, just make a note there. And then similarly, if you want a demo of any of the tools around giving stock, on giving QCDs, increasing your planned gifts, whatever, just make a note there and someone will reach out to you. And these people are really wonderful and lovely, and I'm sure you'll really enjoy the conversation. So if you'd like to do that, great. And now what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a 60-second break. I'm gonna take a look at a bunch of the questions. If you don't mind using this time to fill out the survey, that will be incredibly helpful. And so we'll come back in about 60 seconds with some of the sort of most important questions that you have, and we'll go from there. My colleague Simone, by the way, just added this link in the survey, and I will paste it as well. So that link is in the chat if you don't see it. All right, let's get to a couple of questions. A couple notes before we do this. We are going to have another session on July 13th. We're still actually debating what topic. So it might be around donor advised funds. There's a bunch of requests there. It might be around crypto, might be around some more end of year planning. We will get back to you, but we really try to keep an eye on what people are most interested in, what they need to hear most at that point. So we'll keep you updated if you have any suggestions. We have a couple of questions here. Lillian asks, what hotel are you at in Portland? I'm at a hotel called the Sentinel. Thank you for asking that. Other questions. Please explain a direction you would suggest with a repeat donor who for 4 or 5 years has given from a donor advised fund, but this year gave a cash gift. Marianne, great question. One thing is just to ask, right? Saying, hey, we noticed this. Do you still have a donor advised fund? Would you like more advice on how to do that? Sometimes one of the things that happens is, people, there's the old adage of water flowing downhill. People tend to do the thing that's easiest. So if you send them an email and send them a link to a donate page and they whipped out their credit card, it's not always top of mind for people who have donor advised fund that they have it. So you really want to be reminding people at that moment to give out of their DAF. Why is that? You might say, I don't really care if the money comes from a DAF or from a Visa card. Turns out the DAF gifts are going to be much larger. So if I was to donate, and donating out of my DAF, probably on average 2 or 3 or 5 times larger than a cash gift. So you really want to get those gifts from DAFs. Kim says, most of what I've learned about donor advised funds, or DAF, when we say DAF, we mean donor advised funds, is not positive. Love to have you folks do a webinar on the subject, and the ASAC introduced by the Senate. A couple questions on this. We actually have done one before. We'll probably do another one because it's such an important topic for the industry. Look, these are really mixed, right? So there's a bunch of research now that shows DAFs create a ton less money going to nonprofits. Then there's a lot of critiques of that study. And so it's a little bit mixed, but it is really tricky, right? I mean, Fidelity Vanguard, Schwab, good people work at these places, but their incentives is to hold on to the money, right? I mean, the way that Fidelity makes money is two ways, right? One is a management fee on the money, and two is that money is typically invested in Fidelity mutual funds and things like that, and they get more management fees on that, right? So, you sort of follow incentives and think, oh, these places aren't super well designed to be spitting money out left and right, even though they do, right? So, frankly, they're doing better than the incentives would suggest they do, and yet there's still a lot of work to do here. So, we'll do some more deep dives. If you go to the webinars page on FreeWill, there's actually an hour-long session we did on donor-advised funds, and feel free to dive into that. There's some really interesting research there, and we put a lot of work into it, and so go from there. Debbie asks, are there any stats on how many donors named charity as beneficiaries to donor-advised funds upon passing versus letting other family members or financial orgs take on the decision-making? We have not seen great data here, and part of it is that DAFs are relatively new, right? So that you saw this sort of the big rise in DAFs happen over the last 9-10 years. And so there are fewer people who have DAFs who passed away compared with people who have houses that have passed away or things like that. Yet the other thing is that we're not seeing a lot of nonprofits ask about being a beneficiary. And so you just don't get what you don't ask for. And I think over the next 3 years, planned giving is going to really expand into getting beneficiary designations on donor-advised funds. The big wave in planned giving over the last 5 years is getting beneficiary designations from IRAs, from life insurance policies, et cetera, on top of just bequests in a will or a trust. And so I would imagine this is going to extend over the next period. Okay, other questions? Aren't new DAF rules on the table now, 15 and 50-year DAF? Couldn't this be a sleeping giant? Melody, I'm going to take a contrarian view here and think, I'm going to say it almost doesn't matter, right? There's very little money that is going into donor-advised funds that is not coming out in 15 years, that is not coming out in 50 years. And so it's a little bit of regulation. On the margins, doesn't matter. I think that DAFs end up, getting bigger contributions than, say, a family foundation. There's a lot of, there are a lot of family foundations that do great work, but some of the incentives are, well, I can employ my, my kid who doesn't otherwise capable of getting a job in the family foundation. It's nice to have control over that money. The control over money in DAF is a little bit less than control over money in a family foundation. And so, I would say that it's not really going to push a ton of money out the door, even though we wish it would. Hillary asks, 70% of Americans don't have an up-to-date will or estate plan. Is that same trend that apply for major donors, i.e. high net worth individuals, et cetera, et cetera? So yes and no, right? So it is the case that as you get older, more people have wills and trusts. As you get wealthier, more people have wills and trusts. But 50% of boomers don't have one, right? So you're working off a 70% baseline, and still a lot of people don't have it. 50% of people making more than $90,000 a year don't have an estate plan, and so there's a pretty big shift here. Jenny, who you sort of met earlier in the slides, and I did a bunch of research very early on at Stanford, and we were grad students around estate planning, and we were interviewing donors and mostly baby boomers, and we're talking to one gentleman and said, okay, why don't you have an estate plan? And he's like, well, it sort of feels complicated and overwhelming. We're taking notes. Then I sort of look up and I'm like, wait, aren't you a rocket scientist? Right? This guy out in Palo Alto who's just, Stanford PhD, literally building rockets, and found estate planning to be too complicated for him. And so that's actually quite the norm, that people just don't want to do it. Either, the emotional hurdle, they don't really have a reason to, and no one's reminding them to do it. And so that's a big element. Okay, let's do one more question. Judy asks, are there new tax laws pending that will affect high wealth donors? Judy, the infrastructure bill that is currently being debated in the Senate mostly, which is where the votes are going to have to be, has an element in it that is looking at raising the capital gains tax significantly, right? So there have been some chatter about putting it up to 37%. That seems unlikely, but Joe Manchin, who's obviously a pivotal vote in the Senate, Democrat from West Virginia, typically the most conservative member of the Democratic caucus, and so ends up being sort of vote 50. And he's signaling some real willingness to push the capital gains tax up to like 27, 28%. So what does that mean? It's going to result in a massive increase in stock giving and, excuse me, to stock giving into donor advised funds. Why is that? Well, many of you know this, but giving stock saves you on two types of taxes. So you get a full, you don't pay capital gains, and you don't pay, you get a federal income tax deduction, and typically you don't pay state income tax on the capital gains. And so suddenly, if you're in a place like California and that goes up to 28%, let's do some quick math. You could be looking at like 75, 80% savings on the dollar of donating stock by eliminating capital gains and by getting a full income tax deduction for that. And so that will be really, really important, right? And if that happens, expect some seismic shifts and a even greater shift towards stock giving and gifts of appreciated assets, which, just as a quick summary, will be stocks, real estate, right? So you'll see vacation homes that have gone up over time. With the housing boom, you pay full capital gains and taxes if you sell a vacation home. And so that will go up. Things like cryptocurrency, even things like art that are going to grow considerably, the capital gains are going to eat away at a lot of the benefits of selling them. And so the benefits of donating will go up considerably. All right, so let's wrap up there. We're a little bit earlier than usual this time, but give everyone 10 minutes back. Thank you all for joining. Those of you that are surviving the heat up in Pacific Northwest, I hope you're doing well. But I know that there's just so much happening in your personal lives on top of navigating a massively different professional existence than you had 2 years ago. And so being here and pushing yourself to learn more is just a real credit to you, to the organizations you're working towards. And hopefully this is helpful because the missions that you're working on are so important. So a huge thank you to you. A huge thank you to many of my colleagues who put a lot of work in to make this presentation. And hopefully we'll see you on July 13th, and we will make sure that the topic is worth your while and hopefully considerably useful. So a big thank you, and looking forward to seeing you in a few weeks.